everyone, welcome to episode number 8 of Voices of Italy Beyond La Dolce Vita. I'm Alessia, your host, and this week's episode is going to be about an aspect of Italian culture and society that is not exactly the most popular one. Italy is often seen as the land of warmth, hospitality, and brava gente, where the life flows at the relaxed rhythm of the dolce vita. But if you've ever tried to get something done in an official setting here, you know there's another side to explore. In today's episode, we're diving into this lesser known Italy and its culture of formality, social protocols, and unwritten language rules that a lot of times don't make much sense. But that's part of the charm, right? So sit back, relax, and get ready to meet the Italy that doesn't make it to TikTok or travel blogs. Italy is one of the most iconic countries in the world. But what does Italy mean to the world? What does it mean to you?
Buongiorno.
Pizza.
Ciao Bella.
Michelangelo.
Spaghetti.
Mafia. Dolce Vita.
My name is Alessia, I'm Italian, and this is Voices of Italy, the podcast that peels back the layers of the Instagram perfect Italy to reveal everyday stories of authentic, surprising, and messy Italian life. So, I feel like I need to give a little bit of clarity on what this episode is going to be about. This came to my mind because this past week, I really had to deal with a lot of bureaucracy here in Italy, and it really made me think of a lot of aspects of our culture, our daily life, that it's probably so far away from what the usual idea of Italy is that I found it super interesting. But the episode is not exactly about bureaucracy. We're going there, but I want to give you some insights on this deeper, more authentic, and less known side of Italian culture. It has to do with the way that we are used to interact in formal situations, from work to education to interacting with public administration or just with people in a very formal situation. Let me start with a story that I think really perfectly illustrates this culture of formality in Italy. The other day, I was emailing a contact about a potential collaboration for this podcast. It was really an exciting opportunity to bring some more authentic Italian stories to the podcast. So I contacted this association using the online form on their website. But the conversation, the more it was going on, because they actually replied and they started to show some interest. But at a certain point, it started to feel uneasy. It was a feeling that I hadn't experienced in a while. And it wasn't because I'm not used to having formal professional conversations via email. I was considering that as sort of a professional exchange. But it took me a moment to realize why I was feeling that way. I work in an international company that works in many different countries in Europe and outside Europe. So I got used to interacting with non-Italians. And this implies that I'm used to, for example, make sure that I know who I'm talking to and that I call them by their name. And I just realized that in that email exchange that I was having with this association, I didn't even know the name or the entity that I was communicating with. It was basically, like I was talking to this ambiguous entity the whole time. And it might sound a little trivial, but think about it. I have approached this association to collaborate for one of my podcast episodes. And while it's absolutely normal, of course, that the first interaction is a little generic with a form, or a generic office email, at a certain point, you would expect the courtesy after I introduced myself, made a proposal, and the collaboration was confirmed, to get at least a contact name or something like that. And yet, I was sending my fourth or fifth email response, and yet I didn't know who I was talking to. All the initial emails that I received were signed off as simply the directorate of the association, like sort of the management of this association. And the person I was supposed to work with for the episode is their own chairman. So the presidente, in this case, of the association in Italian. And when I asked to interact directly with the chairman, whose name is not even, by the way, indicated in the website, I don't know the name of the chairman, but in any case, my request was simply ignored, and instead they started to sign off the following emails with the presidency, the chairmanship, instead of just giving me a name. This is, I think, a textbook example of how formality in Italy is very often a tool, maybe to maintain some sort of hierarchy rather than structuring an efficient interaction. Here, again, we're having a conversation that definitely can be categorized as professional, and the refusal to provide a name, even when it's explicitly asked, I really don't think it was an oversight. I think it was a deliberate way to establish some sort of power dynamic. I reached out to them, and they are this association that, works within certain high level social classes in North Italy. So I think for maybe involuntarily it sends the message, we are important, you should feel honored to speak to us. Maybe if I had been part of their social circle, or if I was approaching from a bigger, more relevant business entity, maybe the attitude and the language would have been different. It's interesting to see a few linguistic examples that say a lot about the attitude and the social aspects that it's visible on a daily basis if you work, study, or in general you have to interact with any public or official setting in Italy. Something that can be confusing for English speakers, for example, is the difference between the formal and informal way of speaking, what we call the lei versus the tu kind of addressing, while other European languages have really a very similar language system. Italian has these two ways of saying you. Lei is the more formal, and tu is the less formal. The distinction exists again in many languages. In Italy, I want to say carries that extra weight. So in professional or work related settings, the expectation is to use lei, the formal version, until the other person explicitly tells you that you can switch to the informal one. But sometimes that invitation never comes. You can be in this permanent state of formality, even among longtime colleagues or business partners. The lay form sometimes just stays the default mode and keeps the interaction a little more cold, a little more impersonal. And now it's much easier for me to actually feel comfortable with it, because again, working in an international company where first name basis interactions are really the norm, unless of course you find more rare cases, but most of the time people start talking to each other and addressing each other with first name almost immediately. And so I've grown used to this more direct and relaxed communication style. When I occasionally work with Italians and suggest dropping the formality right away at the beginning of the conversation, they always seem relieved, like a weight has been lifted. It's almost as if using the tu, the informal version, allows us to sort of take off a mask and speak human to human instead of role to role, if it makes any sense. It is very, very liberatory. With my job, for example, I very often interview people, have to give interviews, and especially in that situation where, again, there is this sort of power dynamic, I always see that suggesting to move to the informal way of talking, or at least, again, of course, it doesn't go completely informal. They're not talking to me as if I was their sister or something, but linguistically speaking, that switch from lei to tu or already puts people in a much more visibly comfortable position. Another fascinating aspect of formality in Italian language is the, I wouldn't say excessive use of job titles. Addressing somebody by their professional title is actually something very common. And it isn't just polite in certain industries and circles, it's expected in most cases to be addressed essentially with your job title. And even if you're not sure what the person's job is, in a formal context, it can be taken very bad if you don't appropriately address the person with the correct title. I know it sounds like some sort of monarchical nobility thing, but again, we're not just about talking about high ranking officials or politicians. I don't know, in some context, even relatively common jobs demand this level of recognition. I'm referring to jobs like attorneys, engineers, directors of anything, managers of anything, school deans, etc. And all very normal jobs nowadays, but they used to be socially very relevant, as only richer classes had access to the necessary financial means to reach that kind of position in the past. I guess that sort of culturally important positionality in society kind of stuck around in this case. I've always disliked this habit, to be honest. It's not like there's not an appropriate way, of course, to address someone with their title or with the necessary respect, but unfortunately, Italians attribute a lot of value to the empty formalities that come with a certain social position. And those formalities really determine the level of respect you are expected to have. When I think about this aspect, I always think about one specific experience that happened to me in one of my previous jobs. I was working in an admin support job, and it involved working with a lot of specialized attorneys and engineers that worked for my same company, and also with others that were representing our clients. So addressing all of them with the correct title, avvocato and ingegnere, regardless of the setting, regardless of how long we've been exchanging, was very important. And this one time, for example, I think it was my second month there at that job, I needed to send an email to a client representative that I simply didn't know. And all I was given was his name, email address, and the message. I made a mistake. I addressed this guy who was a lawyer as Mr. Instead of avvocato in my email, because I thought, I'm not sure what your job is. I'm just going to call you Mr. something with your last name. And the next day, I got called in my boss's office. And he was so mad that, he started to yell at me and say that I was making him lose clients. It's not like I called him by his first name or something, but that was something that in my boss's mind was really being offensive towards a client. And that's simply maybe not super intuitive for foreigners, I imagine, because you would expect a little bit of flexibility on that side. And I think, at least from my point of view, this way of using titles with this kind of expectation gives me a little bit of anxiety, and I think gives that general feeling to a lot of people here. And it's not so crazy, to be honest. It's not so crazy to feel intimidated by that interaction. Another example that comes to my mind is the official version of the Italian job for university deans. I heard this for the first time when I was doing my bachelor, and how officially a university dean is called in Italy is il magnifico rettore, literally the magnificent dean. That's the official job title. I tried to research where it comes from, but it seems that it's not super clear. Probably the term magnificent is used because it was attributed to great figures of power, such as, for example, Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. And nowadays, this exact title is used in all universities in Italy. It's just a formal title, sure, but it's used in every document, in every official event, and it certainly adds this extra layer of formality and, honestly, pompousness. And I really think it contributes to unconsciously building up social hierarchies. It's more of a almost a remnant of the past, where education and social mobility were essentially privileges to the upper class. So the emphasis on titles in this case, I think, really serves as a social marker. And hey, maybe I'm biased here. Maybe it's because I like when language tells a story about the society where the language is used. But I also wanted to talk about another specific part of the language, and actually a specific word that is used for the uniquely convoluted language of Italian bureaucracy, and it's burocratese. I think similar translations exist in other languages, but I in Italy it's something super, super identifiable. It's used to describe this peculiar language of public offices that linguistically it's totally arbitrary, and it's filled with a bunch of archaic and overcomplicated phrasing that seem to be designed to confuse people rather than clarify or increase communication in any way. For example, official documents rarely use simple words like inviare, so send or receive, ricevere. Instead, they go for more complicated phrases like, for example, if I wanted to say send, provvedere alla trasmissione, literally proceed with the transmission. If you're filling out a government form, expect to read these words and phrase structures that nobody uses in real life outside those documents, outside those offices. It's some sort of dead language, just like Latin, but at least the church decided to use common Italian for most of the rites and ceremonies instead of Latin to, get closer to the common man in the street. But Italian offices, no, they don't give up on burocratese at all. It's such a complicated register that, sometimes you can hear these conspiracy theories in Italy that the government purposely makes it all so complicated to deceive people or to just make them give up on processes and things that are not absolutely necessary. So I'm really talking about any form, certificate, regulation, guidelines, anything that you can think of that comes from public administration. At times it's so complicated that even Italians with higher education struggle to navigate this mess. Lately, I've been reading lots of formal stuff. As I was saying, I'm dealing with a bunch of bureaucratic things and tax documents, and I needed to file some of those documents. And my boyfriend needed some help also with reading some university guidelines in Italian. And I'm telling you, almost always I need to read some stuff twice before it's clear to me. I have to sort of try to interpret it as if I needed to translate it in a normal Italian language. And like sometimes ChatGPT writes things in a weird way that is not exactly wrong. On the contrary, it even sounds more eloquent, but somehow it sounds odd and robotic. I think that's a good way to think about how burocratese sounds. Overcomplicated, a little cringe at times, and unnecessarily formal. So essentially, if something can be said in a more complicated and archaic sounding way, it probably will. You need to pay a fine. The letter won't just say to make a payment. Instead, you will be invited to effettuare il versamento dell'importo dovuto tramite il canale di pagamento previsto dalla normativa vigente, blah, 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 meaning you are pleased, invited to process the payment with the due amount through the established payment method by the law, etc., etc. Because, yes, most of those documents also quote the laws with their codes all the time. Even just if you need to provide your residency declaration, the document usually mentions the literal piece of law. But you can find, actually, now that I think about it, laws and regulations cited everywhere in websites, in normal instructions. Again, anything that comes from an official entity will have this kind of extra formal robotic language and information. Even though I really like all these linguistic aspects, I'm kind of a nerd for this. Formality in Italy isn't just about the way we talk, though. It's more than a linguistic aspect. It tells something about our culture and society. It sort of reflects Italian society. Sometimes may feel kind of outdated, especially to younger generations, of course, who usually prefer, of course, a more informal approach when possible, especially because we're all more influenced by globalization, digital communication. For older people, it's definitely more normal. It really says something about Italian culture in general. For example, if you just look at the education system, universities in Italy are still structured around a very hierarchical relationship between students and professors. It makes it really harder for students here to challenge authority or to introduce fresh perspectives. I think sometimes the way we communicate with our professors here sort of gives this intimidating feeling to people. You don't really feel like it's your mentor, it's more someone that has authority over you, and that's already socially accepted, but it's reinforced by the language, by the use of something like magnifico rettore, or the extra respectful language and formal attitude that we have with professors. The same could be also but formality can say something also about our family culture. And what comes to my mind in this case is in the relationship between my mom and her father. My mom grew up in a very small town in Sicily, and my mom used to use with her own father the formal addressing, with but not even the one that I've been telling you about so far, not even the lei, an even more formal one, which is the voi, essentially the plural you. That it's a very archaic way to call somebody. Today is really not used anymore at all. In no formal setting you will hear somebody using the voi instead of the lei, and it's crazy to me to think that my mom used to address her father that way. This feels impossible today, but it tells you something about how society worked back then. The late form, as I was saying before, is also used to simply show respect towards people who are older than you. You can say that you can start feeling an adult when people start addressing you with the lay form. And a common joke for women in Italy, is that the first time someone starts calling you signora instead of signorina and using the lei instead of the tu, girls start feeling old. And there's the usual joke, oh no, she called me signora, I must look so old to her. Wow. It's completely different for men, because it's more perceived, if anything, as a sign of authority that someone is calling you with the lei or is calling you signore. So yeah, in this case, maybe it reflects a little bit of sexism, if anything. But this is really how important I think the culture of formality is in Italy. It really tells you a lot about Italian society today. Despite young Italians definitely being a lot more loose and using the two form much more easily than in the past, the fact that our population is quite aged. The use of these formalities a lot more solid and kind of hard to soften up. But I would be happy already with getting rid of Burocratese and having a little less of a headache every time I read an official document. But what's your experience with Italian formalities? Do you love them? Are you crazy? Or you find them exhausting? You're a normal guy. Let me know in the comments. And if you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe and review. It's incredibly helpful. And for those of you who want to dive deeper into this topic, I highly recommend watching Sole a Catinelle. It's an hilarious yet insightful film that really touches on the pressures of society, expectations, family dynamics, and the length that we go for formalities. It's a great way to see how those things play out in a modern Italian context. Let me know your thoughts after watching.